Greetings, my fellow mortals! I am back again with another album review, and we are reviewing the new Darkthrone album, It Beckons Us All. Now, I'm sure everybody knows who Darkthrone is, but for anybody who doesn't know, I will explain. Darkthrone is one of the biggest Norwegian metal bands, ever. They are also one of the biggest giants in the early Norwegian black metal scene. They're also one of the few Norwegian black metal bands from that era that actually They would initially form in 1986 as a band called Black Death and release 2 demos there, and then, dissolve that and form Darkthrone. They started off as a death metal band and would remain a death metal band for their first 4 demos, and eventually their 1991 debut album, Soulside Journey, which is my least favorite album in the Darkthrone discography. However, in 1992, they would switch it up entirely, get involved with the Norwegian black metal kids in that era, and release their second album, A Blaze in the Northern Sky. This album still has a little bit of death metal in it, but this is where they really started to transition into black metal. Then in 1993, they would release their third album, Under a Funeral Moon, which a lot of people say is like their first full-fledged black metal album, since A Blaze in the Northern Sky still had some death metal in it. Then, in 1994, they would release their cult classic 4th studio album, Transylvanian Hunger. This album is definitely one of, if not the earliest example of raw black metal that would be formed in the later years. In 1995, they would release their 5th album, Panzerfaust, which is known for having the popular song Quintessence. In 1996, they would release their 6th album, Total Death. In that same year, they would release the album Goat Lord, which was supposed to be their second album and be a death metal album, but later came out as an unfinished album. And this is also one of my least favorites. I think it's their worst album, but, In 1999, they would release their 8th album, Ravishing Grimness. Then in 2001, they would release their album Plague Wielder. Then in 2003, they would release their album Hate Them. Then in 2004, they would release their 11th album, Sardonic Wrath. This, I think, would be their last full-fledged black metal album. In 2006, they would release their 12th album, The Cult Is Alive, which I believe this is the album where they started to experiment with crust punk, and would be one of the earliest examples of blackened crust, which is black metal and crust punk together. In 2007, they would release the album FOAD, which means Fuck Off and Die. That's the name right there. In 2008, they would release the album Dark Thrones and Black Flags. In 2010, they would release their 15th album, Circle the Wagon. This album is where they started to experiment with heavy and speed metal while still having that bit of black metal sound, even though they're not a black metal band anymore. Then in 2013, they would release the album The Underground Resistance. Then in 2016, they would release their 17th album, Arctic Thunder. Then, in 2019, they would release their 18th album, Old Star. This album is where I think they start to experiment with more doom and heavy metal, or it might have been Arctic Thunder or Old Star. It's one of those two. Then, in 2021, they would release their 19th album, Eternal Hails. This album was on my end-of-year list in 2021. Then, in 2022, they would release their 20th album, Astral Fortress. Now, I missed this album back in 2022, which then finally leads to this new album right here. Whew. That was a lot to say, because that's a lot of albums. This is their 21st album overall, or 20th if you consider, Goat Lord to be, their 7th album, I think. And this is a pretty good album right here. On It Beckons Us All, Darkthrone continues to experiment with that black/doom/heavy metal sound. The majority of the tracks sound a lot like old Black Sabbath, and that's not really a bad thing at all. Both Fenris and Nocturnal Culto did really good with the vocals as well as the other instrumentation, because those vocals were really good, and the instrumentation, was good. You can clearly hear that there's still some black metal influence, even though some people wouldn't consider them to be black metal anymore, and they don't consider themselves to be black metal anymore. But it is still a really good album nonetheless. My favorite tracks overall would have to be Eon 3, Black Dawn Affiliation, The Heavy Hand, and The Lone Pines of the Lost Planet. The track, The Bird People of Nordland, is my highlight track. And my least favorite track, I think, would have to be like the first track off of the album. It's not a bad track, but not something I would go back. And overall, I think I would rate this album really good, 8.5 out of 10. It is really, really good, but, it kind of felt like it was missing something. But it's, like I said, it's still a really good album. But that's just how I feel. Feel free to check out the album yourself. It is available on all platforms, both digitally and physically. You can get, I think there are cassettes, but if there are, go get them. There are CDs, there are vinyls. Although I did see on Darkthrone's Instagram that there was a spelling error on the vinyls, and Peaceville's trying to get it fixed and all that. So hopefully that'll be resolved soon. And when that does, I'll definitely get me a copy of that album. And that's about it. Till then, my fellow mortals.